have a practice called Wolff Architects, and the firm is seen as a vehicle for addressing social inequities as well as the erasure of indigenous landscapes and narratives. The firm also has a very diverse set of employees and collaborators ranging from photographers, artists, filmmakers, and writers, and is involved in a range of issues from social justice advocacy, research and scholarship, and conceptual art. The practice is also obviously focused on practical design business with consultancy services, but in addition has an in-studio art gallery, a publication, and various artistic interventions. And so what the work does is blur the line between design, art, and activism, which is unusual in a city like Cape Town. So ILZE Wolff co-directs with Heinrich the practice, which is concerned with what they call an architecture of consequence. ILZE is an author of the award-winning 2017 book, Unstitching Wreck's True Form, a story of an African factory. And her work also, looks at this modernist garment factory and its entanglement with issues of race, class, gender, and urban space. So the work for her work with the practice, she was shortlisted for the 2018 Architecture Review's Moira Gemmell Award for Emerging Architects. She was a fellow at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape and is co-founder of the publication and research platform called Pamphlet. So there's much more I can tell you about ILZE's work. She's this pamphlet, which I've seen and contributed something to somehow, I think, a while back, featured in numerous local and international platforms. And recently she wrote an essay in the Architectural Review on gardens as sites of resistance, which I find really interesting, and perhaps you'll mention it because there's really innovative dimensions to the work that many people don't assume is part of architectural practice. And so this is a practice where collaboration with artists, activists, and scholars is not unusual at all. Heinrich Wolff is an architect and project manager with 25 years of experience, and we were fortunate to have Heinrich give a seminar years ago, in the days when you could actually give seminars in person. He engaged with our students and then in the afternoon gave a seminar on work, and it was a Danoon work, which we found fascinating, issues of the kind of repurposing of informal settlement structures in ways that were really fascinating, and he'd done a really lot of very rich empirical research on how people use space in informal settlements. Together with ILZE, Heinrich has been involved in many arts, educational, residential, commercial, and healthcare buildings, which have been completed and won numerous awards and been on exhibition in MoMA and various architectural biennales, as well as being a visiting professor at Harvard and the University of Goa in India, and is currently an adjunct associate professor at UCT. And there's a lot more I could say about both of them, but I think it would be really great to begin. We've got around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A if that's all right. And if you need a little bit more time, no problem. So thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. And as I say, this will be, I'm very keen to use these kinds of interactions for further teaching as well. And I know other people who are not present today will be tuning in. So thanks.
Thank you very much. I just want to correct you. I'm not on the UCT staff at the moment. I was about 10 years ago. I'm teaching at Harvard at the moment, but not at UCT.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and we're thrilled to be here. Can you all hear us properly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Obviously, it would have been much better to be having this conversation in person, but we'll try our best to share what we've been doing and what we're up to through this platform. Reflections on the social and emotional landscape. It is well known that Saul Plaatje was one of the first public intellectuals to document the effects of dispossession through his book, Native Life in South Africa. Saul Plaatje is the figure you see on the screen at the moment. He moved through Southern Africa and visited both the urban and most remote areas on what he called tours of observation. There is a period film called Come See the Bioscope, which is a fictional depiction of him, played by actor Ernest Ndlovu, moving through the country and noting down in a large notebook what he sees, the aftermath of the 1913 Native Land Act. In one of the scenes, he stops his car and is greeted by a local boy. The interaction is friendly and brief. Plaatje asks for directions, and the boy Musi is curious about the car and asks for a ride. Plaatje then picks a flower from the ground, but before he places it in the large notebook, the boy asks him what he will do with that flower. While writing down some notes, Plaatje answers that he is keeping a record of everything that he sees. He then hands the boy a magnifying glass and invites him to look with him. One understands from this scene that the book that Plaatje is writing are in the notes towards Native Life in South Africa. So the Native Life in South Africa is a document and a book that we use as a way to think through some of the things that we have been observing in South Africa currently, that has its roots in what Plaatje was observing in 1913, the mass removals and moving of people in the landscape. In one particular chapter in this book called One Night with the Fugitives, chapter 4, he talks about encountering some of the people along the way, and he's always speaking in a collective manner. He always talks about we and the party and the group of people that was walking with him. But when one reads that chapter, one understands that it is not just an observation and a recording, but it is also a way to give counsel to some of the people that he encounters. It is a way to record the emotions of people that he encounters, the emotions of what he feels and his party feels when they're moving through this landscape. In one particular scene, he actually describes a pain that he physically feels in his neck when he encounters some of the people and some of the stories through this new law that he calls the plague law. So the work that we do in the office pays homage to some of the work that Saul Plaatje did, and in fact continues or tries to continue some of these observations. And I'll just share, two instances, two projects that we've recently engaged with. One is a project called Summer Flowers, and the other one is a project that is currently on the table called Steinkop, is the provisional title. But ultimately the work is a retelling of these familiar narratives of the brutal expulsion of people from ancestral land in South Africa Yet we also want to pay attention to ideas of fugitivity, homage, refusal, and collective freedoms as uncovered through these projects. These projects are all public engagements, public interventions that speak of the Black social imagination. But the major thing that we are also concerned with is the emotional landscape and its potential for a renewed and emancipatory spatial practice. If we are serious about an emancipatory spatial practice, then one must also pay close attention to the structures of feeling, as perhaps somebody like Robert Williams spoke about in the 1970s. Taking account and making records is one way of paying attention to it, and in that way, we begin to immerse ourselves in the complexity and range of the emotional landscape, and of course, embrace its tensions. So learning from Plaatje, I will just briefly reflect on some of the recent tours and observations that we enacted and documented through the publication series Pamphlet, Art, Architecture and Stuff. Summer Flowers is a look at a house that the writer, Bessie Head, built for herself in 1969. I became completely obsessed and immersed with this house when I found a drawing that was done by a person called Tom Halsinger. Tom Halsinger is one of Bessie Head's major champions. He is part of the Bessie Head Trust, together with the Karma Museum members and others. And he drew this plan as a way of making an application for it to become a national heritage site in Botswana. When you look at this house from the outside, and when you look at images of the house, it looks like a very typical and standard house, reminiscent of the South African 51/9 houses that was given and constructed for people in racialized townships in South Africa. But when you look at the plan and when you look at the layout, it is a complete subversion of that particular house, because one enters the house not from a formal dining room or a sitting room. You enter the house from the kitchen. You presume the house to be a typical 51/9 house, but when you look at the plans closely, you see that it has a very direct move away from the typical 51/1 plan, where you enter the house straight from the kitchen. I've written somewhere in another publication that, when I saw this house, it reminded me a lot of my grandmother's house. My grandparents having had to be moved from the middle of Stellenbosch in a place called De Vlakte, where they were given a house by the apartheid government in a place called Cloetisville. And that house, if you are a stranger to the family, you would enter it from the front door and into a formal dining room with gladiolus flowers on my grandmother's stinkwood table, brasso in the display cabinet, and all kinds of family pictures and things in the formal dining room. However, if you were a member of the family, or if you were a very good friend of the family, you would enter the house at the back through the kitchen, where most of the geselligheid will actually be happening. So, in a way, this Bessie Head's house is reminiscent of my grandmother's house in Cloetisville, but rather than having any kinds of pretensions about how to enter, the house in Serowe allows people to come, anybody essentially, to enter the house through the kitchen. But what we were also interested in when we were looking at this project is the very extensive garden that surrounded this house. We were told that Bessie Head was a prolific gardener, and her work as a gardener linked her to people like Robert Sobukwe, who she wrote letters to Robert Sobukwe, and one of the letters that I found was mostly to do with gardening and exchanging notes on gardening. Bessie Head also found a lot of admiration in the work of Saul Plaatje, and in 1982 she was commissioned to write the foreword for the republication of native life after there were many rediscoveries of the work of Plaatje in the kind of resistance literature that was so needed at the time. This is an image of photographs that we found in the Kama Third Memorial Museum in Serowe, which is an archive of all Bessie Head's work, photographs, and it was quite a moment when we found this very particular portrait of Sol Plaatje in the archive of her works. And part of the project that we did was to make a film about the work, which you can have access to on Vimeo. But the idea of Bessie Head as a gardener, as a writer, as an architect was extremely useful for us to think through a new kind of emancipatory practice for ourselves and potentially for others. This is an image that we found of Bessie Head writing to Alice Walker, for instance, where again it was about Alice Walker's book Revolutionary Petunias. So the idea of gardening and of flowers is particularly strong in the archive and in the body of Bessie Head's work. And it became a kind of a big motive in how to represent the work. So part of the exercise that we did was to collect plant material in areas where Bessie Head would have been, in Cape Town, in District 6. She spent time in District 6, for instance, as a journalist for the Golden City Post. She spent time in, as we know, in Serowe, in Botswana. And then we also collected plant material and flowers from forced removal sites in and around Cape Town, for instance, in Protea Village, and also with Protea parking lot, which is one of the parking lots currently in District 6, where there's a small community garden, being propagated. And what this begins to do is to create a new kind of archive, extends the archive that Bessie Head started or began, and to think through what the potentiality of an aesthetic through that. The plant material that we collected was then pressed, and they're still in our offices, currently being pressed 2 years later. This is a clipping that we pressed and displayed at on a mural at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which was one of the iterations of this research. But it is a plant material that comes directly from Bessie Head's house, from a tree there. And it becomes material for us to make artworks, to presence the work of Bessie Head in a kind of an aesthetic, and then layer it with some of the material we found in the archive. For instance, like this photograph, which is a documentation of Bessie Head and her very good friend Bosele Sianana in the garden, communal garden that was started by members of this community in Serowe, and a garden that becomes, in my opinion, a site of resistance for some of the, not just a site of resistance, but a site that sits adjacent in 1969 and 1972, adjacent to the kind of brutalities that South Africa was experiencing through the brutal forced removals. So the image of people, of people in Serowe, people that are in exile, people that are dealing with food insecurities, people that are dealing with apartheid, and the image of them making this communal garden and making a communal practice, that being simultaneous to people's dispossession in places like South Africa and other parts of Southern Africa, becomes a very potent tension for us to deal with and to think through when we are developing our spatial practice. One of the potent moments for us during this research was to create a space like the one we did in Chicago, and it actually, by chance, becoming a space, and it was intentional for us that it becomes a space of conversation But the kind of conversation that happened there on this day, we couldn't have anticipated. You see us sitting here, Heinrich took the photograph. You see us sitting here with people from the Rework Foundation, Rework Architectural Foundation, people like Swart Amory, who's sitting there in the yellow shirt and the black dots, the founder of the Rework Architectural Foundation in Palestine, who've been for more than 2 decades been rebuilding architectural works in Rework that has been damaged or demolished because of the occupation that's happening there. So this idea of building adjacent to destruction is very powerful for us, and we were able to share that with our colleagues because of the space that we created at the biennial conversation space. And then on the screen that you see now is some of the literature that we begin to weave into our practice. At the top is a book called House of Bondage, which is a documentation, photographic documentation project by Ernest Cole. Modikwe Dikobe wrote the only novel that I could find about city and suburban in Johannesburg. Village of the Rainwind is by Bessie Head, which is a documentation of Serowe at the time, and native life we've spoken about. But these become, in my opinion, architectural monographs of places and of urban spaces that we can read up again and think through. So I'll end my part of the presentation with this project called Steinkop, and I'll just briefly describe what we see. Maybe Heinrich, while I'm reading, do you mind just flipping the moving the slides over?
Sure.
Thank you. I first got to know the building because of the beautiful article and photos published in the International Architect magazine in 1985. As a student, I fell in love with the composition of forms, the allure of the scale in the semi-desert landscape, and then the incredibly refined sequence of spaces and volumes set out in the plans and sections. Later, in 1998, photographer Angela Buckland's images of the building were published in Blank Architecture, Apartheid and After. In her images, mostly portraits of locals, and some shots of shoes hanging from telephone poles, the building formed a background to a kind of question Buckland seems to have raised about the nature of the idea of community upliftment through public architecture. You can move to the next one. Her images were skeptical and narrative. The melancholic frame within which the buildings and people were captured intrigued me, as well as a single caption which describes it as one of South Africa's first community centers. But more recently, I was interested in this building because of a story someone told me. Shortly after the building was completed in the 1980s, an anthropologist studied the circumstances around which the buildings were commissioned and constructed. Broadly speaking, what he, Charles Carter, described in his thesis was that Anglo-American minds commissioned architects Eyton Boogaard and Rosendahl to design a community facility for the town of Steinkop. Steinkop is historically a colored reserve in the Namaqualand, Northern Cape, with a bitter history of land inhabited by indigenous Khoi, Nama and San people and then appropriated by colonial settlers. The London Missionary Society also settled here, and later German missionaries settled more aggressively, changing the name from Kookfontein to Steinkop. Copper and diamonds were also discovered in the Namaqualand district, became part of the economic system that provided cheap labor to these mines. The German missionary societies also held a strong grip on the social practices of people of Steinkop and laid down strict rules, essentially instilled a civilizing mission in the name of religion. But one of the many rules and taboos that the German missionaries introduced was no dancing. Towns Townspeople were not allowed to dance, an act seen as unchristian. To which extent this was resisted, I have not yet determined. But it was within this setup that Eyton Bogaert and Roosendaal were commissioned to intervene in the late 1970s in what was then seen as an extremely impoverished town. They proposed a hall and a library. During the construction, the building overshot the budget, and Anglo-American Mines refused to finance the project further. The mining company then looked to the Steinkop residents to further finance the building, and the community indebted themselves to the mining company to complete the structure. And one of the ways in which the Steinkop residents raised enough money for the building is to hold dance competitions and dance parties. They also had a raffle where you could win a Ford Cortina as a way of raising money. In a cruel, ironic twist of the plot, the community raised money for a building that was meant to be of benefit to the area, given to them by a very system that created the condition of impoverishment in which they found themselves by breaking a historic taboo. On a recent trip in July 2016, we found the building in a state that is worthy of an invested thinking and consideration. It is currently vacant, and all fixtures and sanitary ware has been stripped. Do you want to show them?
Go down there.
Yeah. The building is covered and the floor is in a habitable condition. A group of local Rastafari devotees have become custodians to the building. They plan events there and have covered the walls in art relating to Rastafari spirituality and indigenous political leadership of the past. One way of thinking about the site and the building is as in a state of ruin. An alternative way would be to consider the building and the site as a means to think of imaginative ways to engage with the site, given its historically strange, racist, and ideological perversions. So, can we think of this building as a site of emancipatory practice? And one of the ways is to think through what we're currently going to be embarking on is another trip there where we've invited a musician to compose a musical score for the building, together with a conceptual artist called Bronwyn Katz, who is going to think through the method of performance. And through that road trip with Bronwyn Katz and the musician Fernando Damon, we will actually begin to think through, how one can have an alternative conversation about this building. So reflecting on these interventions, one could consider some provisional thoughts. What is the restorative power in observation and recall when wandering ruins or landscapes and sites of forced removals? In which ways are lost communal practices resurrected through these wanderings, these tours of observations? How can we reflect equally on the emotional landscape as we do on the landscapes themselves? Within a revised consciousness of the politicized and emotionalized nature of land, how can we begin to provide new methodologies of landscape design, horticultural and agricultural science, and the ethics and of spatial practice in general? So I'll leave the presentation here, and Heinrich could maybe just take us through some of the work that we do as a practice through looking at some of the projects.
Hi, Stephen asked us two things. One is to speak about the idea of urban futures, and the other one is he asked us to speak about some of our buildings in particular. We're going to speak very much about the concept of urban futures, but maybe not so much about our buildings. Sorry, Stephen. Let me explain to you why I don't want to do what Stephen is telling us, because I think that within this context there's a bigger debate to be had. So Stephen asked us to speak about one of our buildings, which is the Vredenburg Hospital, which is a project we completed recently. Now, this is a public building. It's public by its nature, and its urbanity is very easy to establish because it basically is established through its brief. There's very little that we have to do to make it public, and in the context of urban futures, that is a limited debate. I think we can contribute more to it. We recently finished another project, which is a school for kids with special learning needs, where there was not this call for a public nature because it's not so accessible, it's a very protective space and so on. And we were asked for a school with classrooms connected with a central corridor. We were keen not to make a central corridor, but rather to make a kind of a public space. So we were in search of the public space, or let's say the city, as it represents itself inside a school. So to think of these classrooms where kids get taught domestic skills, and to think of a communal space where they learn to engage with each other in an urban manner, and in that way hint towards the city, for us was important. But I don't want to talk so much about these projects, although Stephen asked me to talk about them. I want to talk about some two other things with regard, or I want to talk about this concept of urban futures. Now, urban futures is a very basic concept, but of course its implications are multiple and complex. And in the same way, I want to answer this with a very basic answer, to say I think that in our interest in urban futures, we are looking at three things. Excuse me, I did not take any notes. I suffer from bad memory, so I might have these moments where I just go blank on you. But the first thing is to say the future of the city will be shaped by the will of the people. And to say is that we are in our studies trying to study the will of the people as an inevitability in the city, and considering the cities that we are in, unlike Berlin, this city is overwhelmingly formed by citizens shaping the city for themselves, as opposed to being shaped by planners and architects and so on. So in other words, as designers, we follow the will of the people. Our actions come after the will of the people. We need to understand and study the will of the people in order to shape the city to accommodate. So like I would design a house to accommodate its residents, we need to design the city to accommodate the will of the people. That brings in the second significant thing, is this thing of design. As much as the primary shaping force of the city is citizens, it is very important to consider the role of design and to reconsider the role of design within cities where citizens shape it primarily. The third one is some postulations about the concept of infrastructure. One is, what infrastructures do we need, which ones do we have, and so on, but that is the most basic level of consideration of infrastructure. We are interested in some other notions of infrastructure. So one is that infrastructure has a politics in itself. They are like living, breathing animals. So in South Africa, we have the infrastructure of apartheid in terms of its built physical infrastructures that sit in the city, and they exert their force after the end of apartheid. So in other words, infrastructures outlive the politics that bring them about, but they exert their politics afterwards. The second one is that we're interested in the fact that these infrastructures are not just physical, but they are also non-physical. So the emotional infrastructures, like the stuff that ILZE was talking about, there are all sorts of non-physical dimensions to this infrastructure. And the third aspect of infrastructure that we're very interested in is this notion that infrastructure can connect and equally disconnect. So the N2 highway can connect from east to west, Stellenbosch to Cape Town. It can disconnect Langa from Athlone. as a racialized barrier. So the same device that connects can also disconnect. Now I'll come to that. Now, because you mentioned the link with Germany, I was thinking of a conversation I had with a German student of mine when I was teaching in Switzerland. We were talking about a 4 square meter space on a plan, and I said to him, it's a public space. And he said, no, man, you're misunderstanding me. He was pointing to it. And I said, yes, that's a public space. And he said, it cannot be public, it's too small. And I said to him, that in South Africa is a public space. And here's a photograph of such a space. And let us just consider what we are seeing here, is that we are seeing a woman washing clothing, and she does this as a business. She does her own clothing, but she does the same task also as a business for others. She's here with a friend who looks after children. They come here regularly to this space. This space is fenced off from the street, but open to the street. So another friend walks past in the street, you can talk through this fence. But it has another feature, is that the kids are safe, but also the adults, through their conglomeration here, provide an infrastructure of care to each other. In other words, one of these women could decide to go to the shop and either leave the washing with the other one just checking that it doesn't disappear, or the kids being left here and somebody running down to the shop, this lady running down to the shop, and the other person quickly looking after the kid. So they make this world possible and they provide freedoms. Now that is why we build cities. We don't build cities to enhance conglomeration. We build cities to enhance benefits. And our concern is that in South Africa particularly, we're building bigger and bigger conglomerations with fewer and fewer benefits to its citizens. So we are, of course, keen to design cities that enhance benefits and reduce the burden of conglomeration. So just to go very quickly through other research that Stephen is familiar with, this is a drawing of a bunch of women having a daycare. There's no building here. They come together at a mosque in the noon. They look after children and they provide a certain kind of an infrastructure. This is similar. This is a place that does hair and they sell cell phone equipment and so on, but there's a socialization that happens at the shop that's in excess of hairdressers and customers. Friends come and sit around here, and we have found this pattern of socialization as a fairly consistent one, where you have businesses with people socializing at the mouth of the business. So there's a social and a commercial dimension that coincide. I don't want to go into this in detail, but this is part of a study that Stephen knows, where we studied the noon and we studied rentable apartments, and we studied just how they all fit together. We studied the effect that alcohol sale has on taverns. We studied how houses, say, become daycare centers, and how houses have become specialized infrastructures. So what was conceived of as an RDP house, that is a residential space, has actually become a space that allows entrepreneurial activity. It is an infrastructure for entrepreneurial activity, considering how low the threshold of entry is, say, into this economic activity in the case of daycare centers. We also studied cul-de-sacs and how cul-de-sacs become an infrastructure for, say, car maintenance in this case. We studied a taxi rank as a primary generator of business and activity, and then the secondary activities in these containers that sit around them, excuse the lag, where you have these secondary businesses that can only survive because they're next to the taxi rank. And then you have these tertiary businesses of people who wash cars, fix tires and so on, who are sort of a walking shop, but they can only exist as tertiary businesses because of the existence of the secondary and the primary business. And we are interested in this correspondence of interest because it comes back to this notion of benefit that is the raison d'etre of a city. And we are looking at the reoccurrence of this thing of Shizunyama, that is a street-based meat barbecue space that occurs outside a shebeen, which is a place where alcohol is sold. I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but for the benefit of some of one of the projects I want to discuss, I want to just show us that we did a very close reading of how people occupy space, because these apartments are 6 to 13 square meter apartments. We looked at how people provide safety for themselves, how young people who move in here, what do they have, what makes their world if they're single, how you live with others. So these are apartments connected by a corridor with people washing there in public, washing their bodies in private, and sharing bathrooms. But how, what do you have in a 6 square meter apartment if there are 3 people living there, and what does it look like? And if there are shops, what is the commercial correspondence between the shop owner and the residential stuff, and what is the economic model? So one of the projects that some of you might know is the watershed and the waterfront, where we were approached to do a business incubator. And we basically convinced the waterfront company to reshape the building to take our observations of Dunoon into account, where we said to them, the ground level is super valuable, so don't build a business incubator there. Hover the business incubator up on the first floor and make a market that is down on the ground floor, so that the business incubator claiming to know business then conducts itself in such a way that it creates business opportunities by its urban design. I'm not talking about its practices as a business incubator. I'm talking about how it conducts itself in the city, because it's our postulation that part of the contemporary destruction of our city is very much due to the actions of contemporary capitalism and how big business conducts itself. So we motivated for a market that is built below the business incubator. And in this market, you find that there's a series of businesses that are small, like the ones that we saw in Dunoon. 4 square meter, this is a 2 square meter business. It pays much more rent than Louis Vuitton per square meter, and its income is much higher. So it's a benefit to the landowner, it's a benefit to the stall owner, and mutual benefit has been established, which is the motor of cities in a way. So this results in a plan that looks something like this, where you see a whole lot of businesses, tiny little ones, coexisting in the same space. And the business incubator then hovering up above, and you'll see these holes up here looking down at the space, where there's a reciprocity between people learning about business and people who are conducting business. So somebody learning may want to watch people conducting business as a way of learning business. And people conducting business may want to further themselves by connecting to a business incubator and learning skills there. The other bit of research that I'm not going to go into, I just want to use as a very, very basic reference point on this notion of infrastructure, is we try to find ways of drawing infrastructure. So this is Langa Township with its buffer zones around it, white pinelands there, Bonteheuwel there, with the roads separating it. And we started developing ways of visualizing what infrastructure prevents by making it black, and making open city structures white, and showing the plethora of owners in a multicolored set of properties. I'm not going to go into that, but in this case, this is a study of the enduring qualities of infrastructure and the capacity to disconnect as much as it can connect. Now, how does this sort of study of predatorial capitalism in the 21st century come into design? So we were approached by a developer to develop this tiny little piece of land here. It is 3 plots, one there, and one there. It was laid out in the 1950s with an idea that there will be one suburban house built on everyone. So in other words, the imagination is for 3 houses to be built here to accommodate a mother, a father, 2 blonde children, a dog and a cat. Things have changed, and we want to change the city and its demographic and its purposes through this development. So just to give you a reference, this is an urban drawing, and this is what we are proposing. So what we are proposing in essence is that we use a new bylaw that allows you to build 3 houses on every suburban subdivision. So where the conception originally was for 3 houses, we're now building 9 houses on the same piece of land. But we are doing this is a Trojan horse. Let me show you how it works if you want to know how a focus on the city can transform architecture. This is the elevation on the lane side of this development. It shows 5 buildings in a row with a very beautiful proportion and 5 front doors right onto the street. It has direct urbanity. It has windows that overlooks the street, makes it safe, and it has courtyards right behind these walls, and there's overlap between that private function and the public function of the street. All well known. You say, well, what is this contribution possibly that makes this so new? Let me show you here. If you look from the other side, you see garages, everything. It represents a kind of a suburban ideal. This plan is done for the sales brochure where it speaks to a certain suburban narrative. In other words, downstairs you have a gate, you come in, there's a tiny little court. You have a front door, there's a kitchen, a dining room and a living room. Now the idea is that everybody lives like this. Upstairs you go, there's a stair, there's mommy and daddy, there is Johnny and Susan in their bedroom. I'm talking about that racialized previous conception of the city. Now we are very keen to turn this on its head. Let me show you the X-ray in a way of it. Here you see the site plan in its base suburban conception. The colored in areas would be the internal areas, and you see car parking because the city assumes everybody has cars, wants cars, need cars. The fact that it's very close to public transport seems to be of lesser concern. Let's just have a look. The yellow lines show the 3 properties. So you see 1, 2, 3 houses, 1, 2, 3 houses, 1, 2, 3 houses. But that is the base plan. But now let's think about our 2 bits of reference that I mentioned here. One is the Denoon research that looks at the way in which people genuinely occupy the city, as opposed to suburban dream of mommy, daddy, 2 children, a dog and a car. How would this transform this? And can an architect design housing so that it is designed to take the will of the people into account? And can we design it so that it is an infrastructure that allows the will of the people and becomes an infrastructure that can provide infrastructures of care? So let me show you how this building does a suburban Trojan horse while actually doing something else. This is the exact same plan. Look at it. All I'm doing is I'm saying, what if we consider the gray area, the house? Remember, the areas that we studied in the noon, the houses were between 6 and 13 square meters. These areas are 22 square meters. So they are double the size of the big ones in the noon. It's plenty. They're big houses compared to the will of the people. Now, instead of thinking of the stair and the toilet as a private part of the house, I'm thinking of it as a public infrastructure. In other words, I have a security gate. I can walk right through the house and somebody can make this shared and build a front door there. So this is a corridor. This is a double volume. This is not just architectural delight. This is architectural intentionality to think, how do I indicate the stair and its toilet as public? So we cite it in a double volume that sits inside the space so that this space can be a single space with its own kitchen, bedroom, everything. If we occupy it, you can see what happens there. You see there's a kitchen, there's a seating space, there's a bed. If I remind you of those photographs to noon, the beds are pushed against the wall. They very seldom look like this, but it can be accommodated. There's a dining space and a kitchen. This is a more classic 22 square meter house. This is the suburban dream. It just doesn't have any walls in it because it's a whole family sharing it. You can find somebody building a wall in there, that's also possible, or somebody using a cupboard as a wall and a child sleeping there. And this is what we found in the noon. That becomes a bed at night and a bench during the day. So here's the living room, 4 seats and a table for people to sit, and still a kitchen. So these are full functioning houses. But if we consider this as a movement route, then we can consider that more houses can be built here, and the stair upstairs can have another house because it's a double-story house that's exactly identical. Why is it identical? Is that its spatial pattern can be duplicated because this person can learn from this person, can learn from this person, can learn from this person. And so people are learning how to use this infrastructure and how to adapt and adapt and adapt. Where ILZE and I are living, there's 100-year-old Victorian housing that's double-story, and it's getting better and better and better over a 100-year period because slowly people are learning from each other how to add a kitchen, how to bring the outside bathroom inside, etc., etc. But what we've just done is we've built 3 houses in the space of every one that we designed. And those 3 in the space of the original 1 conception. So where this was a site conceived of for 3 houses, we are now at 27. And it still looks like this. It's decent living environments that provide houses of the scale that people want, assimilated by an architect who makes well-proportioned, well-designed, safe space that makes a decent city. If the additions at the back is built out of corrugated iron, it is no problem whatsoever because nobody sees it. It's nobody's business, and that is the dominant pattern in this neighborhood where this is built. So we are building to allow for this to happen. Then finally, I want to show you even more clandestine stuff that we're busy plotting, and I did this offshore just for the safety of the academic environment. And this is a course that I taught in urban design at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. It was called Dividing Bridges and Bridging Divides. It talk about this capacity of infrastructure to connect and disconnect. We're thinking of rapid urbanization of the most extreme kind. And we were doing this through virtual reality because I was teaching it from South Africa. I never went to the United States. The students were sitting in Spain and Venezuela and China and so on. And we were thinking how new ways of looking can help us to think about this in a new way. But the site is in Cape Town, and you might be familiar with this. This is the King David and Mowbray golf courses, heaven on earth for an extreme minority. The amount of people who play golf in our society is so small that I would say they are negligible and irrelevant. The amount of people who are desperately saying, please, can we share the land? Can we use public land as the first priority of land to be used to house the poor? And we are supporting that investigation through thinking through this image of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara playing golf on the Havana golf course just before they took it over. And they built schools and arts facilities that are to today hallmarks of the Cuban Revolution and the advancement of this. We did this in virtual reality. So this is a virtual classroom where students from all over the world are present through their avatars, and we are comparing work. But we are doing this through rehearsing scenarios. Here we're occupying a bowling green and observatory, which is down the road from us, thinking how we will do this. So we are doing this as a rehearsal of a very serious scenario. Now that we've learned from aircraft pilots. So if you're sitting in your seat in an aircraft and you look out the left wing and the engine is on fire, what do you say to yourself besides, oh, you're saying to yourself, well, I hope this pilot has got some training in this. What kind of training do you expect the pilot to have done this once? If the pilot goes on and say, hi, this is your pilot speaking, I've done this once before, don't panic. What are you going to think? Like, oh, geez, we're in trouble. If he comes on and says, don't panic, I've done this 5 times before. Will you panic? I will still panic. If he says to us, I've done this 500 times before, and I have a 99% success rate of landing this plane under these conditions, would you be comfortable? Maybe you would be. So we are thinking that rapid urbanization of the most extreme kind can be rehearsed, and we can learn how to do this, to build environments in virtual worlds where we can begin to think what is the world that will be created, and to make the mistakes so that we could advise people how to do it. So I want to show you a project that I did in 6 weeks with 2 students called Natasha Harkinson and Iris Kim that considered the occupation of those 2 golf courses over a weekend. It is a very extreme scenario, but the question was, could I ask you to build a city that is responsibly done, that's well designed? I want you to do it over a weekend and no money. That was the brief. So let me tell you how the story goes. The story goes that a boy drives on a taxi past the Rondebosch golf course on the N1. He looks out the window and he sees this beautiful land. He says, well, what an amazing space some people have in the city. He's thinking back of the cattle his grandfather used to herd on what is today the Rondebosch golf course, the Rondebosch Common, because they used to play golf there and they used to herd cattle, but in order to enhance the experience of golf, they chased the cattle herders away. So we were thinking, what would be the emotional aftermath of that? And then the students were thinking, well, one day this boy comes and he hears the people plotting to take over the golf course. So the idea was that they're going to meet regularly to discuss what to do next. They're going to discuss their mistakes through an iterative process, and they're going to make 1 page of rules as to how this land should be occupied. That is how this scheme worked. The idea was one night they decided to occupy the golf course using their cattle rather than their people because they're worried about the ensuing violence. Cattle is roaming on the verges of the N2 anyhow, and we thought that that could be a very safe way to do it. Then they started cutting down the trees of the golf course, not because they're destructive maniacs, but because they need poles to mark out space, because space can be contested, that causes conflict, and you want to make safe space so that everybody knows where they are at. Spaces were formed, and they lived there for a while. There was a contestation with the city, but the cattle were herding on the roughs. They decided to build under the trees and not under the roughs. But one night, his auntie was cooking and she tipped over the primus and her house caught on fire. It burned a large part of the settlement and it was an absolute disaster. They decided to meet again and to make a few rules to say, well, maybe they should not build in the rough, but they should build on the fairway, because they first thought the cattle should have the fairway. So they made a mistake. They crossed out that rule and they made a new rule, but they met again, and so they went on. Then they started building cattle pens, businesses starting to develop, and the settlement moved forward. One night, there was heavy rain in Cape Town and the settlement flooded very, very badly. They started making new rules. They started scratching out some of these rules, and they said what they have to do is to introduce stormwater breaks together with the fire breaks. And so they kept on meeting and meeting, and they started developing this 1 page of rules on how to develop a site like this. So this we did over 6 weeks with these students, with the idea is that if, say, beret-wearing, gun-wielding revolutionaries had to ask a designer, could you help us grab this land, occupy this land? Do we say, no, sorry, that is not our profession, we don't know how to do it? Or do we, in fact, have the capacity to develop the disciplinary knowledge to do this. So let me just show you within this sort of disciplinary way of doing it. What I want to show you here is the idea is in the settlement, you make a road. These 4 pink pegs are the short little branches of trees you cut down to mark a territory. And then there's 6 more pegs that mark a road at an angle. That angle is important because it gets stormwater out and it leads to a pit latrine that people can build themselves. They build a pit latrine and they build it on the further side. The idea is that when people settle on this piece of land, that piece of land is open. That toilet can be upgraded over time. That land is open as circulation so that a better pipe can be laid in that space. So we keep public space open for the improvement of infrastructure once a deal has been settled with a city as a way of enhancing the future of it. So in conclusion, I want to show you how this unfolds. Here is the golf course today. This is how they saw the primary existing infrastructure. There's a flooding zone that they should never build on. You need that for grazing land so that people can coexist with their animals and all the economies and livelihoods that go with this. These trees, although they cut some down, is seen as a primary beneficial infrastructure of the land. So what they were doing is they were saying is that there are golf cart routes. You get that for free, so you're using it. So the golf cart routes is used as the primary structuring of the settlement. And then to be responsible towards the environment, another set of routes are laid out. That slide disappeared. That is parallel to the golf cart route. So that's the golf cart routes, and there's the other one. And these 2 routes hold the trees that are in the rough. They are giant, beautiful trees. And it says this will be green forever after. Then fire breaks are introduced perpendicular to the fairways and the roughs. And the same fire break and the same route gets stormwater out. And it is all a topographic feature. The topography tells you where this is. And the southeaster blows in this direction. And urban fires spread along with the big directional winds. So the fire breaks are perpendicular to the directional winds. Then what we are doing is the settlement is laid out so that stormwater can get out of the blocks and the toilet infrastructure is developed. I want to just show you. So this is a typical road. Here is the old rough with the golf cart route. So the trees between the golf cart route and the other road that was made gets protected. This is the green, the fairway, and that's what we're building on. The stakes are planted there to mark our territory so that there's not contestation of the land, because the enumeration of the land in a way reduces conflict. Then pit latrines are built there as a way of preventing urban disease. That can be done on the first weekend. Then a series of houses are built there that makes clumps of 6 to 12 houses. And the important thing of that is that's the scale of the houses in Dunoon. And what it is a micro scale of governance. You can call it a body corporate, you can call it a street committee, whatever, but it's a body of governance. So it is democracy at its small scale. That can grow over time to something that is bigger and bigger, and so the city can settle. And it results in an urban section like this. The Black River over there, the edge of the terrain that's very sloping here, we can't build on. The fairways running this direction, the fire breaks running this direction, and urban blocks being made. And the beauty of having these blocks where 6 to 8 houses can develop, it follows a Mexican logic of land settlement of courtyard houses. So you don't have these tiny, tiny properties that then fixes the future of the city. You could make deals with people to conglomerate those properties to build bigger development. So we are thinking what's going to happen with the subdivision of properties over the next 100 years or so, and how will that make a successful city? And you can see this is the typical pattern: urban block, green parkway, and then grazing land for cattle. And that's in essence how we thought we could settle the Mowbray and Rondebosch golf courses with a plan made over a weekend and with no cash. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilze. And there's so much here to think about. Some of us are going to have to go through this again, so it's a good thing it's recorded. But I suppose what I'm interested in, and people can come in, please get your thoughts and questions ready, is you both work with what you see in the world and you translate that into ideas about design in such extraordinary ways. And I don't want to claim this is, you know, what my discipline does, but there's something quite appealing about that for me. You know, the ethnographic sensibility is there in your work. It's whatever you want to call it. You may not want that framing of it, but it's really observing very closely what is actually happening, then thinking through the logic of that at a kind of spatial level and seeing, how you can translate that into design. So, I mean, there are so many dimensions to this. I mean, the Steinkop Community Centre is extraordinary, you know, just thinking about the many lives of that building, that it's, you know, it's an infrastructure that's constantly mutating, you know, and being reappropriated. I mean, the idea of musicians and Rastafarians, artists, seeing this as a space that has value, so it gets revalued and so on. And then the translation from Dunoon to these other spaces in the city is also quite extraordinary. You know, thinking through the moving from 3 buildings to 27. Yeah, that idea of large numbers of people use space differently in the city and use space perhaps way more efficiently, rather than the middle classes with large homes and few people living on it. So anyway, there's so many aspects to this, and I don't want to take up more time because I think are there hands available, I mean, or waiting to come in? Matthew, can you assist me? I see Ilana has her hand up, so why don't you go first, Ilana?
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ilze and Heinrich. I'm a great admirer of your work. You know, I've been following your work for many years. I'm interested in this idea of the architect as a revolutionary, and I love it. But I was wondering, designing this new infrastructure, this infrastructure of revolution, of kind of mapping emotional and so on landscapes onto places that have been stolen and so on. How do you map that landscape, that infrastructure, onto infrastructures that do exist, that are crumbling, that the city is not maintaining? I love the idea of people being able to settle in ways that are safe for them and dignified and so on. But at one stage we do have a problem with things like runoff of water and so on. Where does it go? Just as an environmental question, where does it all go? We're looking at water tables in Cape Town that are quite shallow. What happens when the water table gets, E. coli in it? How do we protect people further? How does architecture then map onto, the old infrastructures of cities, of municipalities, and so on? How does your activism look, in those intersections?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, in cities, there are a whole lot of objectives that ideally you want to speak to them simultaneously, but that's not always possible. And I think that what we are concerned with in this investigation of occupying the golf courses is a sense that the population of South Africa are absolutely desperate for the cities to be more aligned with their needs and a recognition of the history of land theft and economic alienation that has occurred. And what we are saying is that, this idea that we're going to all sort it out perfectly in one go is just probably not going to happen. So now the question is, what do we prioritize? And we prioritize the will of the people in a way to say is that the land must be settled, but it doesn't have to be done so recklessly, because the recklessly does not come out of the need to settle. It comes out of the inability of professionals to do their jobs in a way, because, underdevelopment can be produced by professionals in this case, by saying, well, this is just too complicated, we can't deal with this, or you shouldn't have done this. So to give you an idea, one of the bizarre things that I came across in Dunoon is that they have dustbins, now speaking off from memory, something like that, dustbins for a population of 25,000 when they knew the population was 190,000 people. And the reason why is that the sanitation department said they shouldn't be squatting there. They shouldn't be building backyard shacks. We built RDP houses, and that's all that should be there. It's one dustbin per house. So the fact that there's 7 houses on every property, they shouldn't. So they just didn't provide the dustbins because there's a moral judgment on what is right and not right. So what we are saying is we're trying to acknowledge the will of the people to be housed and to redress the spatial inequities of the city. So for that, we need to move on to the land fast, and we have to take something like the golf courses that is obviously there and ready to be used. Now, when it comes to the water table, you'll see as we looked at the flood zone and the fact that we said that we must avoid the flood zone, we were looking at the fact that you could cause sewage to pond inside the courtyards itself, which causes urban disease. And the urban disease has a rapid impact. It's like urban fires. It can cause massive destruction very, very fast. But with the idea is that land rights may have to be negotiated while the settlement goes on. So the pattern of a U-shaped courtyard with the possibility of adding a sewer in future, saying we know that it's not good that sewage runs over the surface, but we also know it's not good to racialize black people, alienate them from land and say, well, there's just nothing that can be done, like what has been happening with the golf courses, the appeal to give this over to people for housing. So that intransigence is not productive or healthy for our psychological health as a society. We remain schizophrenic and at war with ourselves, so to speak. So we are saying is let's settle the land and let's then negotiate with the city, knowing the urgency of building sewage infrastructure and not settle it in a way that prevents that from happening in the imminent future. So that's kind of the strategy.
Fantastic. No, I really appreciate that. I know how resistant the city is to any kind of claims on land. I mean, that Rondebosch common is, or that Rondebosch golf course is rented to a bunch of, as you say, a tiny number of people for, I think it's something now, 1,000 Rand a year or something absolutely criminal. Yeah. I appreciate the fact that you're thinking ahead in ways in which we can almost violently take it, from a city that's absolutely not moving at all on these issues.
Yeah. Can I correct you? I do not support violence.
No, I mean violently in the sense of, taking it without the city giving you either infrastructure first and waiting for it to plan and so on and so forth, that as you say, I like the idea of the cattle being used as a kind of a bulwark and then moving people. But when I mean violently, I'm not talking about physical violence. I'm talking about the fact that you're not waiting for the city to put in the infrastructure and all the excuses they usually have.
Yes,
but you come with your design that makes it possible for the city to then adapt.
In my heart, I'm a university man, so I believe that if we do our job well, we can come up with ideas that's so potent that ideas can reign rather than the one with the biggest fist. That is what we want to. This is a project against violence, I think. So, I mean, I can imagine lots of people think you want to build shacks on a golf course. You know, I can see how it's construed as a kind of a violent counter-reaction. But this is to say, can ideas reign, and can we think our futures rather than let them run away from us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I mean, again, you know, this question that I wanted to raise earlier was around infrastructures, because in fact the course that this lecture was going to be part of deals a lot with infrastructure as well. There are people writing about slow infrastructures, fast infrastructures. It seemed like the city, if we can imagine this as a machine, it's really into fast infrastructures that work efficiently in their terms. So it's standardized RDP housing is the ideal way to go. And then when they're quite innovative occupations, such as the Reclaim the City occupation, the Woodstock Hospital, there's real resistance to go there, notwithstanding extraordinary creativity at all sorts, at governance levels. Architects were involved in looking at the building and, you know, trying to imagine how one could improve and repair aspects of that building that was vacant for decades. You know, so one sees all of this happening. One sees occupations happening in some places, or the city shuts it down quite quickly. But there doesn't seem to be a sensibility that is open to your ideas, whether it's the thinking about Steinkop Community Center has been incredibly creative repurposing. With perhaps they'd only see the ruins as deficit as opposed to possibility. So likewise, Woodstock Hospital looks like a ruin, and therefore you can't see what's being done in everyday practices there. And I'm sure if you walked through there, you'd be blown away by how people actually use these small spaces and what they've done with them. And in fact, Matthew, who's here, he did his MA on the Woodstock occupation, and various other researchers have found this an extraordinary space, but it's seen as a deficit because it doesn't look orderly. I mean, I'm taking a while to get at that, but how does one work in a city? And I don't want to necessarily say the city has one vision, but sometimes it seems like it has one vision. So the idea to develop the Amazon site at the Two River Urban Park seems to be the option, the way to go. This is about making a competitive global city. So this is the world at the level of city administration, city vision. Can there be a translation from what you're doing, both of you, in your different ways, to in a way that can resonate? Do you get any responses of interest from people in that world? So I think I could go on and on because this is so interesting. I'll restrain myself.
I think the ideas that we try and make work attract a certain kind of person. So the Fenwick Lane is a developer that is in line with the kind of thinking about density different to what any other developer would think about. So I mean, there's a measure of risk taking that is required. So yeah, I mean, I think the people we attract to the practice, the people that commission works, the people that we work with, in some ways must align to create these openings. The Steinkop project is not is something that we initiated in the office ourselves. So it's not a commission. We're not holding anybody to account. It's a kind of a building that's in public ownership. But we've got a little bit of funding to speculate. From somebody that is invested in. Actually, the architects, they are interested in the architects' work, so they offered us funding to think about this project, So whether it will eventually go on and, become a model or a prototype for for the Steinkop itself is an open question, but it could be a prototype for something else later. If another project like that comes into the office and we realize, but we can use the methodologies that we developed in the Steinkop project, and we can use the kind of thinking we developed. So these things are not neatly situated within the actual projects. So the project that Heinrich developed with his students in Harvard is a speculative project. So that will eventually help us to speak with wisdom and with clarity with the city then if that opportunity comes up. So yeah, we engage ourselves in like speculative research, so when the opportunity comes, then we're ready in a way.
Yeah. I can maybe just also add to it is that there's something about where urban futures and sustainability coincide in this consideration of adaptation. It's one thing about asking the question about how you can be globally competitive, but at a base level, the question is, are you adapting to your own needs? Because, at the most basic level, if you're talking about sustainability, you say societies survive or go extinct. One of the two. You're either ahead of the wave or you're behind the wave. There's no sort of being right on it somewhere. So you either adapt and you can move, keep on moving, or you're simply going extinct and you're losing. So, it comes to this idea of globally competitive, and I'm not entirely averse to the idea of being globally competitive, but I have a problem when the economic rules go for some and not for others. So if certain economic rules of freedom go for big business, but not small business. So big business can have the holy land there between the two rivers, but somebody selling mangoes cannot sell it on Observatory's main road. Now, what is the problem with selling mangoes on Observatory's main road? I mean, I can tell you what's the problem with building on this ecologically, socially sensitive area of the Two Rivers Urban Park. That's much easier to say what's the problem. But the mangoes on the street, I don't know. So you go to Kinshasa, the city belongs to the people. People are selling everything anyway. On the middleman of the N1 highway, they're selling stuff. There's a sense that the city belongs to those who live and work in it, right? That is our ideal. And we're saying, okay, if we are open for business, let us be open for business, but for everybody. Let us then be one of those business cities. Let's be that if we want to, but let it go for everybody. Or if we're going to be a bit more circumspect, let's be circumspect with everybody. But so we can't claim to be open for business, but actually just open for big business. That is super nasty, and that's what I have in other texts called the crime of our time. In the context of the worst inequality on earth, allow that. That is the crime of our time.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Matthew.
Yeah. Sorry?
Yes, Stephen, yeah. I have a comment. So as Stephen noted, firstly, thank you very much for the presentation. It was extremely interesting. Like Stephen said, I did my master's research on Reclaim the City, and as you note about the Rondebosch golf course, they were sort of the activists that made this space somewhat visible and problematized, like Ilana says, Prof. van Wyk said, problematized the rental agreements and so on. And now the city of Cape Town is actually apparently considering this space for different types of development. But also with Reclaim the City's work, they found that, and this is what you note in your research, but the WEX developments, the WEX developments in Woodstock, they've been developed, but the way that they've been developed and the rooms and the sort of apartments that are being developed don't really fit into the livelihoods or the lifestyles or the ways of living of the people that live in Woodstock and have lived in Woodstock for generations. So I think it's quite interesting to. So the Reclaim the City, this is my question, would be around the Reclaim the City occupations. And if you know anything, I'm sure you're quite clued up about them, but they've started thinking about how to reuse these spaces, how to repurpose these spaces. And they sort of come together and have these co-architecture sort of meetings where they try and think about how can the space be used other than just the way a hospital sort of is structured. So basically my question would be, are you finding that organizations like Reclaim the City or other organizations are trying to engage this sort of different the ideas of developing space in a different way, or is this so limited because of the framework of sort of gentrification, neoliberal capital in the area? And I just one last thing was Jordan Hill Lewis this morning wrote in the Daily Maverick about these micro developers as his sort of way to save or deal with the housing crisis in the Daily Maverick this morning. I thought you might find that interesting. Thanks.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of people that we look to that are engaged in emancipatory spatial practice, in many ways, So Reclaim the City is an advocacy group that is doing very important work around thinking about occupation of prime land differently. But there are many groups that are thinking about cultural ways of occupying the space. There's a group in Johannesburg called the Keleketla Library who's doing very important work around the drill hall in the middle of Johannesburg. There is Chimarenga in Cape Town that's doing wonderful work, site-specific work around music and sonic experiences, thinking about a kind of a broader frame of collective freedom in space. There's people like Breaking Bread, who had a beautiful restaurant in Brooklyn, actually, pre-COVID, where it wasn't a restaurant, actually, it was a home. It was their home that they opened up for gigs and served food and had cultural experiences and exhibitions and things like that. So, I mean, this idea of home and of making space, there are people in the Palestinian world who've been thinking a lot about this idea of how does one not become an occupier of space, but how do you become a host as well? How do you host space? How do you become a host in the city? That's also one of our concerns. How do you think of architectural space and occupying it in many different ways, not just about living there, but culturally occupying space as well. And I've just named a few, but I mean there are many others that we look to. I mean, I'm also just thinking of our friend in the Newland Spring, that we went to go and visit, Stephen, who occupied that space in a very particular way, and unfortunately it wasn't supported by the authorities, and in a way independent practices begin to support each other in different ways. So I don't know if that answers the question, but there's what I'm just saying is that multiple ways of occupying space.
Can I think we unfortunately need to close. It shows you I would be happy to go on for another hour, I promise you. But about the spring, tomorrow, in fact, there is a walk of remembrance, which I've been involved in, but it's driven by the Claremont Main Road Mosque, and it's part of an attempt to create a organization around remembrance, restitution, environmental justice, etc. The name of it isn't clear yet, but it's a walk of former residents through Newlands Village and parts of Claremont. So, and we'll be going to the spring, so I hope some of you can come from 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Oh, nice.
So, these things take their time to, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. Hopefully we can discuss it, but it's about pushing back on the complete erasure of any traces of people having lived in Newlands Village prior to the forced removals of the 60s. yeah, there's a lot that we should. I would like, and I'm sure many others would like to continue this conversation. I hope we can, and I'm very pleased we're able to record this. We could discuss whether we could put it on YouTube, but I will definitely, if it's okay with you, use it for teaching. I think so many issues have been raised in both your discussions here that we could spend quite a while engaging with. So thank you both very much.
Thanks, Stephen.
It's been fantastic to see you again, even if it's virtually. But and just hearing what you're doing and the extraordinary capacity. People talk about interdisciplinarity, but they talk about it. You actually do it. You're extracting art, music, architecture, design, in extraordinary ways that are extremely compelling. Thank you.
It's really not fun to be stuck in your discipline, Stephen.
I know. I'm an interloper, but I've got to pretend I'm in a discipline, So my colleagues think I struggle too much.
Yeah, it's fun. Thank you for having us, and thank you for listening, and thanks for the engagement.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Hope to
Cheers.
Be in touch soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Matthew, for sort of technical stuff and all that. And all the best to all of you. Have a good Heritage Day tomorrow, everyone. And there's a lot going on in Salt River. There's some really interesting things going on Saturday. So
saw that. Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
All right.
Cheers.
Good to see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.